Hey everybody, Jay Binkowitz here, and I'm being joined by Dr. Mickey Kling, and we're really both excited about sharing with you this series being presented by iThrive on building your business for profit, a step-to-step guide to understanding and improving your cash flow, which we all know is an important buzzword if we want to stay in business. So both Mickey and I are going to lead these initial sessions as it relates to P&L talk and EBITDA talk and cash flow talk, all those fun topics. We're also going to be joined by Dr. Ron Mika and Patty Warren, who's going to tack on to what we're doing and add information on how do we leverage new initiatives within our business to impact our EBITDA. So very, very exciting series. And with that, I'm going to hand this off to Mick a little bit to take the lead.
Awesome, Jay. Thank you so much. I really always look forward to having these fun conversations with you. So really looking forward to this whole series. We're going to tackle a bunch of really important financial matters in and around your practice. We're going to talk about what EBITDA is and why it matters. We're going to talk a little bit about how to simplify your profit and loss statement. How do we get to this term EBITDA and how that is impacted by something called add backs and adjustments. And then finally, and most importantly, we're going to talk about how can we improve this EBITDA in our businesses, because really the value of what we have as a company or as a business is really driven by this concept of EBITDA. So let's go ahead and get into it. So in this first video, we're going to talk about why EBITDA matters. And we're going to talk a little bit about the state of the industry and give you some examples. But before we do that, let's just talk about this term EBITDA. So if you've heard this buzzword and you're not really sure what it means, let's just break this down for just a minute. So EBITDA is an accounting acronym that stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So think about this from your business perspective just a minute. Your business has earnings, so you have income that comes in and you have expenses related to that. And what's left over is your net income or your earnings. And what EBITDA takes into consideration is that number before we take into the fact that you may have some interest if you borrowed money and have to pay back some interest for that borrowed money. It considers the earnings of your business before the interest expenses. It also considers it before taxes are paid because, believe it or not, our CPAs can get super creative about our tax liability. And so our tax burden can change based on the aggressiveness of our CPAs. So we want to remove the tax consideration in the formula. And then the last things that are not considered are two non-cash expenses called depreciation and amortization. So we're essentially looking at the earnings of the business before we take into consideration the impact of interest, taxes, and the two non-cash expenses, depreciation and amortization.
That's great. And before we jump in and look at all this math, I think it's always good to remind ourselves, where's the industry at and what does that mean? I always find it always interesting to look at these type of numbers. It's a $40 billion industry with steady growth. It's considered a semi-insulated industry, a slightly recession-proof example because we provide products and services. And at the end of the day, people are always going to need to have their eyes taken care of. They're always going to need to be able to see. So it makes it a very healthy industry to be involved in. I think also, Mick, what's really interesting here is that when we look at the percentages of examinations that are being provided, the independents still rule that field. There's no question that is owned by the independents. And although optical goods have kind of come to a split as to who's providing them, and 46% independents, almost a 50-50. What else I think is interesting here is the number of ophthalmologists have remained the same over the last 10 years. So there was 18,000 ophthalmologists 10 years ago. There's 18,000 ophthalmologists today. And in conjunction with that number, we've had 6,000 optometrists increase in the last 10 years, where ophthalmologists have stayed flat. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's a huge, huge, wonderful, big billboard sign that says this is good, because ophthalmology is not growing with the population. That's falling back on optometry to fill the gap in medical optometry. Again, the patients are coming to us in larger amounts because ophthalmology can't handle them. So that's just good news for us as an industry and optometry as a career in general.
Yeah, Jay, one thing that I would comment about this, I find it really interesting that 2/3 of the population still prefers to go to the independent route to get their exam services. The challenge that the independents have is on the retail side. If you saw to your comment about the retail portion is split 50-50, yet 2/3 are actually providing care. So seems to be this desire to still have an independent doctor provide the care. But then for a segment of the population, they're still maybe looking for other alternatives on the retail side. And so that's an opportunity that obviously independents don't want to miss.
Well, and you're 100% right. And that, of course, relates to convenience, when we're open, when a patient can shop on weekends or evenings so there's so many factors that go into that. But I think much to what you said, what we need to remember is we are not going away. Our businesses are not going away. We may need to recreate ourselves and create other forms of communication and conveniences for our patients in order to keep up with the times. But what industry doesn't have to do that, right? Every industry has to do that. And certainly, without going too deep in it, we've all experienced an unbelievable shift this past year with COVID. We've all learned new ways of running our businesses. We've all learned that we could actually see less patients and generate more revenue per exam, see less patients and have a higher conversion rate. We've learned new ways of doing things. And I hope that everybody takes the good learning outcomes from a terrible situation and helps them transform their businesses to be stronger, healthier businesses in the future. The state of the industry here, this is back from 2017 information. I could tell you it's a little bit more now, but to that degree, there are 22,800 ODs practicing in an independent environment, right? It's still the dominant place to be, so that as optometrists and practice managers always say, oh, what's going to happen with online and what's going to happen with this? I always say, hunker down and worry about the food on your plate and stop looking everywhere else. Let's concentrate about what's within your control, not worry about what's not in your control. And I think much to what you and I are going to deliver during this series, as it relates to their P&Ls, as it relates to their EBITDA, as it relates to initiatives they can roll out to impact their business, it's all about controlling what we can.
Yeah. And, commercial optometry has been around for many, many years. And these numbers, while they do shift to some degree, it's not as if there's this massive influx toward commercial optometry. The independents still control almost 60% of the market. We just saw the data that shows that 2/3 of patients will get their exams in that delivery. So to your point, if you're in an independent setting or a commercial retail setting, it's pretty well established sort of what piece of this big pie that we're consuming.
And the demand's only going to get greater, as we said, as ophthalmology is flat. The demand's only going to get greater for optometry. So it's not getting softer, it's getting better.
Yep.
Well, here's an interesting slide about real examples of why EBITDA matters. So I know we both we spend way too much time looking at spreadsheets and P&Ls and numbers. And so, what's your perspective on this, Mick?
Yeah, so, for me, one of the things that I've learned about this whole idea of EBITDA, and one of the most important messages that I hope we can get across through this series, is that many of us go into practice. Obviously, we need an income. We need to provide for our families and hopefully be able to set aside some for retirement. But what we have to remember is that we own a company, we own a business, and for this business to have value, it actually has to generate profit. And the profit has to be in excess of what you are making or you're being compensated as an owner of the practice. And so what EBITDA does is it really shines a spotlight on the enterprise value or the value of your business after you've compensated yourself as an employee of your company. In other words, a practice that's a little bit on the smaller size, oftentimes what happens is the owner simply just has a job and the business itself doesn't really generate any profitability. But to have value with a practice or have value with a company that has the potential to be transitioned or sold, the enterprise itself has to have measurable profit. And that's what EBITDA does for us. It really allows us to shine a spotlight on the value of the business over and above just providing an income for the owner.
Huge, absolutely. And it's interesting as I think back. I have a dear friend, and he's a dentist, and we've had discussions about his practice, and he's reaching retirement age, and he said to me, "I've never thought of selling my practice." He goes, "I just figured," and so he didn't really invest and reinvest and build. He's been a one-man band. He's had an assistant. He didn't hire a half a dozen dental hygienists. He didn't open up half a dozen new lanes. He didn't go to a fancy. He's just been this very mom and pop way of addressing patient care. And he's exceptional. And when you're with him, he's 100% focused on you, and you get as much time as you need. It's a very special type of environment. But to that degree, when I said to him, "What are you going to do when you're ready to sell the practice?" He goes, "Well, I never really plan on selling it. I've made my money. I've made a good living. I've put away money. I've invested okay. And when the time comes, I'll probably just close my door, or maybe I'll bring in a newbie and kind of hand him the practice." So his whole mindset was he didn't expect to have a big hit at the end of the day. He was making his money along the way. And listen, that's another way of thinking. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. He's lived a good life and continues to live a good life. But I think what you said here is critical. There's a difference between owning, running, and building and selling a business. And there's a difference between owning a job.
Yep.
And that's really what we're talking about. Do you own a business or do you own a job? And it's not a judgment, because neither one of them are bad. They both suit different people a different way.
Yeah. And one of the more difficult conversations that I have to have with doctors when we look at their practice, if it's a little bit of a smaller practice, a lot of times it becomes clear that their business itself really doesn't have a lot of value at all, because it's only provided an income. Now, in this example you gave, this dentist actually did that by choice. But if your goal is to ultimately transition that practice and sell it for it to have value, it's got to be profitable enough to be able to show that as a standalone entity, as a business, that it generates profitability. Because as the new buyer comes in, that's what they're going to want to see. They want to see a return on that investment with the company that they're acquiring.
Right. And I always like to think about the, God forbid, get hit by a bus scenario when I'm talking to doctors. Can your practice still operate if, God forbid, you got hit by a bus tomorrow? And, what are your plans along? Because if you think along those lines and understand that when you're not in the practice, if it shuts down or it's not generating revenue, it's not a business.
Yep.
Yeah. A lot of good areas of conversation there. So, Mick, now we get to talk about one of your favorite topics. I don't know anybody that speaks more P&L language than you do. And I know every time I listen, I'm always learning something as well. So we're looking forward to this next session on simplifying your P&L.